Welcome back to Worldie Unboxed. We have an insightful two-part episode for you featuring a conversation with Nick Trimis, a seasoned startup and venture capitalist attorney. Nick provides a deep dive into the intersection of entrepreneurship and the law, highlighting the potential pitfalls if legal matters aren't addressed early in a venture's life. He shares valuable insights on how founders can optimize their relationship with legal counsel and offers practical advice on legal preparations for VC funding and attracting institutional investors. While this discussion is not legal advice, it offers a unique opportunity to understand the legal challenges startups face and how to navigate them effectively. In next week's episode, we'll be joined by Crystal Kwabea Adu-Poku to review the key points from our conversation with Nick and discuss how they apply to our own venture at Worldie. As always, stay connected with us by joining our community at worldiebrand.com and subscribing to the Worldie YouTube channel for clips of our conversations. All right, let's talk to Nick. So, Nick, welcome to Worldie Unboxed. I guess I could try to give a quick intro, but I think you maybe, providing your own background, you'd probably do a much better job of it. So can you describe your background? Like, how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so kind of a roundabout path for me, but I originally enlisted in the Marine Corps in 2008, switched over to the officer side and did that for a while. When I got out of the Marine Corps, decided I was going to go to law school and went to Northwestern, did the JD MBA program, so got a good chunk of exposure to business folks and entrepreneurship. And that really sort of lit the fire of wanting to be at least adjacent to entrepreneurs in general. Whether or not I have it in my blood or not, I'm not sure. But I then made my way to San Diego and worked for Cooley as a general corporate associate, and subsequently transitioned to a boutique firm based in LA. Still living in San Diego here, but I'm working out of LA with emerging companies and venture capital funds, and doing pretty much emerging companies, early stage work, early stage financing rounds, and whatnot. And yeah, really digging the work right now.
No, that's what's up. We kind of share very similar backgrounds. Military, did the whole JD MBA program, even in Chicago. I mean, I decided to go to
Yeah.
the University of Chicago, so a little bit different there. But yeah, and then also heading to Cooley. So yeah, very similar backgrounds. Reason why we have you on. I'm just kidding. So how did you get interested in startup VC work? Like, was that something that you've always kind of wanted to do? Did you start that like when you were at Northwestern? Like, how'd you get interested?
Yeah, I definitely was interested on the front end. When I started law school and then to business school, it was something that was there. I followed the entrepreneurship law classes at law school, and then did a bunch of clinics up at the business school where we were doing like very basic legal advising for business school students and early stage companies, just like entity selection stuff, basic IP information, understanding what IP is. And that was really, I think, what lit the fire um, of speaking with early stage founders. I found it really fun and interesting. I liked the advising aspect of it. And then my final year in law school, we started a small business clinic. This was COVID era. We started a small business clinic and started helping folks go through the PPP loan process and all sorts of stuff. We brought in a ton of attorneys and law students. And that sort of solidified, like, I like working with founders. I like working with folks who have skin in the game in their businesses. And so when I went to Cooley, I learned a ton. Most of my clients at Cooley were sort of public company, big stuff. And I was pretty removed from talking with founders anyways. And so really found myself wanting to go back that direction pretty quickly. And now that I'm working directly with founders and early stage folks in the companies, I've sort of refound my excitement for where they are. And you sort of feel their excitement too, which is fun.
Lots of excitement, lots of excitement. So kind of diving into some of that that experience, what are some legal must knows from like formation to some of those crucial early stages that these early stage founders should be aware of?
Yeah, so I think entity selection, so like very big, like let's start at the very beginning,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
entity selection is important. So whether you're going to be a partnership, a sole proprietorship, you're going to you're going to incorporate, I mean, LLC or an S corp or a C corp. There's a lot of different considerations. A lot of them tend to be tax focused, so those are important to figure out if it's going to be a pass through tax entity. And I would always recommend talking to tax advice. It's always sort of this caveat I always have where I'm like, hey, I can give you this legal advice, but also you should talk to your tax advisors because that plays into a lot of how you're deciding. Like I can tell you the difference, but it really depends on just it's situationally dependent, right? It depends. But I do think so. I think entity selection is important to think about. Um, Along with that, just sort of trying to look for pretty far forward in how you plan on raising money is important as well. So if you're planning on finding institutional investors, venture capital funds, or if you're just doing friends and family, or you're not going to raise money, all of those play into it because different funding sources typically follow different paths. So venture capital funds oftentimes like to invest in C corporations, sometimes LLCs, but definitely not sole proprietorships. VCs can't invest in S corps. So things like that are really important to consider as you go forward. So as far as the important things, sort of listing out your priorities and understanding the rough road forward. I mean, things change, right? But understanding roughly where you're planning on going is really important just to make sure that you're setting things up cleanly on the front end to avoid having to do a ton of cleanup, expensive, time-consuming work when the time comes later on, if it's not the right way.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So, I guess in your opinion, when is the ideal time for a founder or for a startup to start bringing on legal counsel?
Well, the law firm answer is like right away, right? Before you even have an idea, I'm ready to help. No, I, so it depends on a lot of different factors. I think a couple of the most important factors to consider are what industry you're working in. So if it's a highly regulated industry, it's probably more important to get someone at least to advise early on, and to make sure that you're navigating the various wickets appropriately. If it's not, if it's not a highly regulated industry, you can push it off a little bit. And I think there are things. So incorporation through LegalZoom is common and it works, no problem there. When you start bringing in employees and you're talking about protecting your IP, and issues like that, it's more important that you get it right on the front end, right? Incorporation documents can be updated, and if you need to change your name a little bit or whatever, those are easy. But when you start issuing equity to employees, when you start having significant commercial contracts that are material to your business, those are valuable to be reviewed by an attorney. So I don't think you need a startup attorney right at the get-go. But when things start getting a little more complicated and you find yourself like spending more time worried about legal stuff than the business stuff, then maybe offload some of that to someone who's more an expert in that. And then you can focus a little bit more on the business side of things.
That makes sense. So, maybe a quick story time if you have, or you could share any kind of like experiences that kind of highlight maybe one positive, one negative of a legal decision that kind of shaped a startup's journey.
Yeah, sure. So there are there are founders who start companies who get a lot of traction really quick and start moving, and it's exciting. And I think the underlying point I try to share is that it's a lot easier to keep things clean from the beginning than to clean up. So sort of like, imagine your business is like your email inbox, right? If you set up your forwarding rules and your filing management system and all that stuff on the front end, it's a lot easier to keep control as you go. If all of a sudden you got 20,000 emails in your inbox and you're trying to clean up, you can do it. It's just a lot harder, a lot more time consuming. And for a founder, it's going to be a lot more expensive. So that's sort of like the underlying point, is that when people don't do the good work on the front end, it becomes more expensive on the back end. So it's not, I guess this is not a typical story, but it is something that I've run into a handful of times where founders get really excited. They're bringing on employees and they're issuing equity. And you can't issue equity in your company unless the shares are authorized in your charter documents. So you can't say, hey, I'll give you 100,000 shares of something if you don't have 100,000 shares authorized, right? And so what you end up having to do is clean up on the back end. And you have to basically like reach out to all your shareholders and get a ratification approved by all of them, by the board of directors. You have to reach out to, this was a Delaware corporation. And so we had to reach out to Delaware and file a 204 ratification. And it was just this very long process. And it ended up taking, this was abnormal, but it took like almost 6 months to clean this up. And the problem with that is not that it was expensive because I had to do extra work and I had to reach out to all these shareholders. It was just time consuming and I was charging them. So that was expensive. But the other issue was that when we reached out to Delaware and said, hey, the company accidentally issued these shares and they weren't authorized, that ratification process through Delaware in order to basically clean things up took 6 months, and you can't do anything with Delaware in that 6 months. You can't raise more money. You can't do any changes to your charter documents. You can't do anything. And so you're basically just then marking time for 6 months. So as they were trying to progress and raise money, they couldn't do anything. And so that's a huge, huge issue, especially because they were gaining traction and then basically got the kibosh put on them saying like, stop, you don't get to do anything else. So that's a bummer. It was a huge bummer for them. On the flip side of that, I recently had a client who, the fundraising environment hasn't been great in the last few years. It's a little bit harder to get money. And this client had a Series A lined up for, I think he was going to raise like $25 or $30 million, a pretty substantial amount of money. And we had worked with him from the very beginning. So all the documents, like everything, the data room was super clean, cap tables like extra tied out, no questions on any of this. It was really easy for investors to come in, do their diligence in the data room and be like, cool, everything looks good. This round fell through. The lead investor fell out on this round. And at that point, it's typically really challenging to find someone else to step in, especially with a tough financing environment and fundraising environment. And in a matter of, this was not us necessarily, this was him that was able to go around and find a new investor, but he was able to find a new investor in under a month. And by sharing our data room, the investor looked at it and was like, oh, sick. Like, yep, easy day. Let's close. And it was the fastest thing I've ever seen as far as a turnaround in a funding round. But I do think a lot of that had to do with the fact that there were zero roadblocks from the legal side. Like we don't necessarily, we're not going to find investors for you as a founder or business owner. But we can definitely put up the roadblocks when, if we're representing a fund, for example, and we come up and we're looking through a company's data room that we're looking, like a portfolio company that we're looking to invest in, and we just see issues, then it just slows the process down. It becomes a slog. We have to clear everything up. It's just a pain in the butt. And with that, you often find delays that turn into investors bowing out, and then money gets lost and left off the table and stuff like that. So I think the underlying current here the underlying point I'm trying to make is that with really clean documents on the front end, as long as you keep your stuff clean, it's a lot easier going forward to make pivots when necessary.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I guess it pays to have good housekeeping. And it kind of like building on the whole idea of like hiring and then the contracts and maybe protecting the company's interests. What's your advice, and maybe beyond just like good housekeeping or having a solid foundation when it comes from a legal perspective? What are some other pieces of advice that you can give a company that's looking to hire or looking to engage in like some kind of like contractual relationship with a third party?
Yeah, so I do think it makes sense to, just along the same lines of good housekeeping, like have a really good form contract is really helpful. So oftentimes a client will reach out and say, hey, we're looking at hiring a bunch of people. Can you send me an employment agreement? I will draft up an employment agreement that has all the healthy information that you need. And as long as it's not a super unique business, it's pretty standard. Most startup attorneys can spin that to you really quickly. It's not going to cost you that much money. And then you can, as a founder, like just duplicate that out for all your new employees coming in, changing terms, start dates, if you're giving equity, things like that. When it comes to employees, I think there are a handful of things that are important to get on the front end. When we're talking about like IP, that's generally very important. And so any intellectual property stuff that you add into employment agreements should be at least reviewed by an attorney, but definitely included. So the standard that we generally see today is called a CIIAA, which is a confidential information invention assignment agreement. And it basically says as an employee, anything you create as an employee belongs to the company. And that's super important for a lot of reasons, to avoid litigation in the future with that employee if things go south. But more importantly, as you're trying to raise money, anyone who comes in and wants to invest is going to say, hey, do you have these invention assignment agreements with your employees? And if you don't, then you got to reach out to your employees and be like, hey guys, I know we didn't do this on the front end. And then it's sort of like weird, awkward conversations. And so when it comes to employees specifically, or even commercial agreements, if you have like a standard distribution agreement or generally available commercial agreements, I think having a good form on the front end just helps you as a business owner, as a founder. You can just go through your typical business process a lot easier, a lot quicker.
No, and that all makes sense. Definitely very, very relevant to us in our current situation. And I know you deal with like a range of different type of clients, from very sophisticated to not so sophisticated. So from the not so sophisticated perspective, as a client, like maybe looks at these form agreements, like what should they be looking at when you guys, you do your work, you draft it up. Now the client's reviewing it. What are they looking at, or what should they be looking at when they review these contracts?
Yeah, that's tough because sometimes these get really complicated just in the legalese, but sometimes it's necessary, right? I do think that there are a couple things that you should really focus on when you get a form contract. Specifically, the IP protection is going to be really important. So just make sure that that's included. Sometimes that gets sort of glossed over and people forget about it. And sometimes they're standalone agreements too. So sometimes, you'll have invention assignment agreements that are incorporated into the language. Oftentimes they're a standalone exhibit. But regardless, make sure that that's in there, because that's going to be a huge pain if you don't have it. I think in general, contracts, something to keep in mind is that you can generally contract around a lot of things. Contracts can be whatever they need to be typically. And so understanding what your main points that you're trying to incorporate into this document and make sure they're in there is important. The last thing I think that you really should focus on, and this is for a lot of, again, it's sort of the same underlying point here, but relationships eventually end, whether it's an employment relationship or a commercial relationship. Oftentimes they end. And if you have not planned for that in your agreements, that's where you can sort of get bit in the butt. And so looking at termination provisions, what happens if someone is terminated for cause? What happens if someone is terminated without cause? What happens if there's a change of control? All those types of terms should be included just to prepare. And it could be a little awkward on the front end if you're asking an employee to sign saying, hey, if we fire you, this happens. Like, it's hard to say it on the front end, but it's a lot easier to say it on the front end than to have to say it in a courtroom afterwards, where you're losing a ton of money on legal fees and payments and all that other stuff. So sort of trying to look forward in case things go south is important. And that's important for founder agreements. You know, if you're talking with co-founders, it's important to just consider it. Because I've definitely had clients that did not consider it and burned their companies to the ground on the way out, which is a bummer.
Yeah, that is a bummer. And kind of sticking with like the founder relationship and maybe like resolving those type of conflicts, using an anecdote experience that I had when I was at a clinic at University of Chicago, and we were working with two founders who were like, pretty much it was like we were like divorced. It was divorce court or whatever for us. So they were just trying to split, like who's gonna keep the baby. So how do you go about resolving those conflicts on the front end, like before they even happen? Like you kind of mentioned like the founder agreement. Is there other ways in which you can kind of like prep yourself for, not an eventual but a potential separation?
Yeah, it's very similar to divorce. I think I've had a handful of folks who have said that, prior to getting married, you should go to counseling. Not for not because anything's wrong, but just to like learn communication style and learn what other expectations are from the other side. And so similarly, talking about this kind of stuff early on when you're happy is really important. And so I always recommend, as early as possible, talk about what your plans are, because sometimes founders think they're aligned, and in one person, they're like, hey, we're going to take this to the grave, and then later find out someone's like, oh no, I just wanted to do it for a couple of years, and then bounce with like my little paycheck and then move on, which is fine. Like both of those are fine. But if you don't know exactly where your co-founder stands, then you're going to run into issues when that does happen. So having that really open and honest communication early on, when everyone's happy and things are going pretty well, is when you should do it, so that when things do eventually fall apart or hit the fan, it's not a fight as much as it is like, oh, what did we agree to earlier? Oh yeah, that's right. Okay, let's just do that then. And then you can relatively amicably move on, whatever that looks like. So again, the same thing as front end preparation. The earlier and better preparation you can do on the front end helps with everything, whether it's good or bad at the end.
Yeah, no, this is a perfect argument for like getting things like started correctly. And then continuing on that like relationship piece, how can founders take, or I guess get the most out of their relationship with their legal counsel?
That's a great question. So there are a lot of lawyers in the world, and there are a lot of lawyers who can kind of do stuff. I am allowed to go to court as an attorney and argue on behalf of someone. I shouldn't, because I would not be good, because that's not my expertise, right? If so in that same vein, I don't think someone who's a great litigator who is going to appellate courts and arguing in front of judges would be such a great person to hire for a startup, for founders to look at, right? And so specifically finding someone who is a startup attorney, who works in this space, is just going to be a lot easier for a lot of reasons, but they're going to be quicker. They're going to have the answers for you faster. It's going to be cheaper for you because they're going to be able to spin stuff to you that they have, and you're going to save money that way. So find someone who knows what they're doing in the startup space is the first recommendation. I also think that being honest and open with your attorney is is also important. So I've had some clients that maybe not intentionally, maybe intentionally, I don't know, we're not as forthright on the front end. And that just becomes expensive because we will uncover stuff as we go and we're like, oh shoot, yeah, that's not okay. We should have changed that, last year. And then you have to do all cleanup work, right? So just being honest and open on the front end about your plans, what has happened, what you've done, what you haven't done. Because again, earlier, if you say, hey, we issued equity, we shouldn't have, we need to fix it. It's way easier to fix it right away than waiting 6 months when a VC is looking at investing. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, they're not going to now. So, so definitely sort of being open and honest. And then I think going back to, if you're talking to a startup attorney, see if they can prepare forms for you of any document that you're going to need to dupe out. So whether that's an employment agreement, consulting agreements, if you're doing safes, that's something we can talk about as well. The SAFE is a simple agreement for future equity. Anything like that they can sort of give you a really good form document where you can then do the work yourself and save money that way. And typically they'll be willing to do it, right? A good startup attorney is not going to sit here and say, you have to use me for every single little document that you need to prepare. They're a little bit higher level than that. And so, yeah, get some good form documents from them as well.
No, that makes sense. And I'm glad you kind of mentioned safes. That'll be a good segue into this like next part, which is more focused on like fundraising and things like that. So is there like general advice? I know it can be specific based upon like the client or the individual, for a startup or a founder or founders who they haven't raised yet, but they're looking to raise. Is there a recommended way of going about it?
Yeah, I think it depends. No, I every VC is a little different. Every industry is a little bit different in what they're looking for. I think that from a legal perspective, there's not a lot that can convince someone to invest, right? If the business is just not a great fit, the market's rough, there's no legal things that can really, that a VC will look at and be like, oh my gosh, their contracts are very well drafted, so we're definitely going to invest, right? That's not going to happen as much as the opposite would happen, where when they're looking through your data room, they're like, oh man, they are not put together. It's a big red flag when you have a really messy data room, governance documents, because when you basically have to open the kimono to VCs when they're investing, and they're going to look at all your documents, all your governance documents, employment agreements, equity, your cap tables. They're going to look at all of it. And if it's messy and there's stuff missing, agreements aren't executed, things like that, it's just a really big red flag, because it's a reflection on how you're running your company. And you can get past it usually, but it makes it more expensive, and you're not going to get as favorable terms as maybe you could if you came in from a stronger standpoint. So I think keeping things tidy as you go is really important. And then from a business standpoint, you got to spin your own story here. So your startup lawyers aren't going to do as good of a job as you are, because they're not quite in the trenches as you are. But when you approach VCs, spinning your story and doing what you need to do on the business side is the first step. And then when you open the kimono, hopefully that's just like the skates have already been greased at that point and you just slide on through, right? Yeah.
So besides like keeping a very tidy like room or whatnot, when I guess when a founder is really like hustling, they're really like getting ready for funding. It could be traditional. It could be like, okay, we're going to do some like pre-seed or something like that. It could be like crowdfunding, friends and family round, or whatever it is, like however which way they decide to raise. What are some like legal roadblocks when you're talking about maybe some of these more non-traditional like methods? I know this is outside of the realm of VC a little bit, but
yeah, so no, that's fine. I think outside, so if you're doing like a friends and family round, or you're doing safes, or you're doing things like that, it's pretty easy to do like a safe round. It's not actually that complicated. And safes are easy because you don't have to do a lot of the paperwork that's required of a typical financing round. So safes will typically convert at the next financing round. And so it's just like an early influx of cash that then will turn into equity at your next financing round. So when at your next financing round, you have to do all your charter amendments, your board and stockholder consents and whatnot. You do typically have to get consents from the board and from stockholders if you're going to do any financing rounds. And that's not really a trip up. It is pretty easy to do, especially if you're working with a startup attorney. They'll have stuff that they can generate for you pretty quickly. Some other, let's see, I mean, I guess from the early stage stuff, the legal aspect is the legal trip ups are not as common as they will be for more seasoned and sophisticated investors. So you don't have to tell your mom or dad like what's going on in your company. They're typically like, yeah, here's X $1,000 and you write them a safe. It's when anyone else comes in and says like, hey, what's up with this cap table? There are a couple things I just having experienced this, I like to sort of steer clients away from crowdsourcing or crowdfunding. So there are some options of getting money through various crowdfunding platforms, and it is a quick way to get money from people you don't necessarily know, from angels who are throwing in $1,000 each. But it's really expensive to deal with going forward. And so it might change in the future. In the next couple of years, we might see some better SPVs, which are special purpose vehicles, who are like intended to invest. But right now it's complicated, and it's complicating the cap tables as you go forward. Again, on the front end, it's not that hard. You can get your money and then move forward. It's just going to limit your growth. And that's the bigger issue, right? So it's not, your friends and family around or your safes, things like that. It's not necessarily the challenge on the front end that like, I can't get people to invest. It is, you can get people to invest, but if then you can't do a series seed or a series A because of the things you did before, then your company's done. And so it's not as much legal hurdles early on, but forecasting and seeing what legal hurdles you're avoiding with your next financing round. So
yeah, I could definitely see that makes sense, especially when you start issuing out equity for these investments, these small investments that are coming through these crowdfunding campaigns. Does that hold true for crowdfunding campaigns that do not issue equity? They're just like, maybe backers are getting different types of rewards for quote unquote investing in a startup.
no, because then it's more of like sales at that point, right? So you're selling a pair of shoes. Like, if you invest early, give us this money and we'll send you a pair of whatever. No, so it's a little bit different. If you're investing like, hey, I'm buying X%, or I'm getting equity, I'm getting shares, that's where it gets really complicated. The crowdfunding for like rewards, where you're just looking to get an info, like at that point you're just preemptively selling, right? Like you're taking pre-orders is what you're doing. So it's definitely not, that's fine, I think, in my opinion.
Now that makes a whole lot of sense. So what wisdom do you have for startups like navigating? So this is going back to like VCs, navigating and negotiating deals with like VCs. And what are some like pitfalls to kind of watch out for?
So every VC is different, right? So VCs are created oftentimes with a specific purpose in mind. What types of companies they're going to invest in, what industries they're going to invest in. And so being just aware of who you're pursuing is helpful. And sometimes, VCs invest in certain types of founders from California, founders from, underrepresented minorities or whatever it is, and just understand that what you're getting into on the front end. The more, this is more like businessy, right? Where the more diligence you do on the front end of knowing your customer, the better your chances are going to be to convince them to come in. some things to think about also in that realm of knowing which VCs you're pursuing. Some VCs are totally fine investing in unique sort of entities, or okay with sort of varied portfolio companies. Some are not, and some like it to be a lot easier. And if you're looking for funding, it's definitely easier to convince a VC to invest if you are a C Corp, like registered in Delaware, like very straightforward, not complicated from that perspective. Now, there are some reasons why you wouldn't, right? For tax reasons, if you're going to incorporate in a different state, there's other reasons why you wouldn't necessarily do that. But like anything, if you can remove any barriers, if you can sort of lubricate the yes, it's a lot easier to get there. So if you come in with your packaged company saying like, look, it's all clean, it's a Delaware C Corp, this is like, there's nothing unique about this structure, it's very standard, it just becomes an easier yes. Again, there are reasons why you wouldn't necessarily incorporate in Delaware or be a C Corp, but understanding that there are some VCs who just won't invest unless you're a C Corp, just keep that in mind, because then you're just, if you're pursuing them, they're going to make you convert. And that's just, I mean, that's not that hard, but it's more money that you're going to have to spend. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's solid. And so now we're going to kind of like shift gears a little bit and kind of talk about what's on the horizon or whatever. We'll have you look into your crystal ball, tell us what's coming up in the future. So what trends, and we obviously can kind of, I don't want to bias you, so I won't say that. I'll let you kind of tell what trends that you see kind of shaping the future of legal considerations in the startup and VC space.
So I got some AI stuff coming up, right? I think that for me, it's the most interesting.
Yeah.
Just because I think the legal question, it's more academic that I'm intrigued about, where, you know, the liability of it, at some point, when does the liability switch from being the person who created the AI, whatever, say, you know, someone coded this thing, the liability is on them if it does something, gives legal advice or whatever. And at some point, it's going to have learned enough that it's no longer tied to the creator, and so maybe it needs insurance on its own. I don't know. And so I think seeing AI, I think, is really interesting in where it's going, just because it's like sort of on the frontier and there's not a clear cut answer. So I think that's interesting as it applies to legal work. I think there are, just like any industry, I think advancements in technology don't necessarily get rid of jobs, but change them quite a bit. And so it gets rid of a lot of the monotonous stuff. I think you're going to see a lot of documents becoming a lot more form when it comes to like employment agreements and things of that nature. But I think that there are going to be a lot more nuanced and interesting commercial agreements where you're having to deal with multiple parties who may be real people and who may not be real people, and trying to figure out those games. And so I think for a while, at least, attorneys have an okay position when it comes to doing this kind of work. But I think that's a big one because we don't really know yet. So
yeah, no, that definitely was kind of what I was alluding to, and I didn't want to throw it out there and say that I steered you in that direction. But yeah, I thought that was kind of crazy, especially like the ethical situations that you can kind of get into from a legal perspective, or attorneys, because there's unbeknownst to many clients, there's a code that attorneys have to abide by, the professional rules. And, you know, when it comes to like confidentiality and things like that, using these AI programs, it kind of sometimes butt heads against that. So no, I thought that was kind of interesting. So let's see, kind of getting towards the end, but And we've kind of talked about like AI a little bit, so we'll move to the next. How do you keep yourself updated, in terms of like the latest and greatest, what's coming out? For instance, there was this like big thing that came out this year when it came to like, uh, I forget the exact law, but it just like you can't hide yourself under these like veiled companies anymore. You kind of got to like
Mhm.
disclose. There's got to be an individual attached to it. Um, how do you keep yourself updated with that type of stuff so that you can kind of like help your startup clients?
I usually ask ChatGPT just to give me
I mean, that's the go-to.
yeah, no, I mean, so my Google alerts are aggressively tailored for certain keywords. So there's part of that. There's a ton, this is so silly, but like there's a ton of LinkedIn scrolling where I just start seeing people like mention this or mention that. I'm like, okay, cool, let me follow that up. And then of course you have there's standard like aggregators of legal information that will push stuff out. And I feel like typically attorneys who are staying current, which is important because things change quite a bit. Attorneys who are staying current generally have some sort of aggregator or resource attorney at their firm or something that they're relying on. And so for me, we have sort of a resource process at the firm, but I also have my own individual Google alerts and stuff like that. I do usually spend in the morning. Part of my routine in the morning is to spend 15-20 minutes just sort of perusing the internet for any updates I can find. And as you mentioned, there are some big stuff that come down the pike, and that stuff is a lot easier to follow because it's coming. But you have like the National Venture Capital Association, NVCA. That's an organization that we use a lot of their documents for financing rounds. And they're also have resource attorneys. So sort of once you're able to get your finger on the pulse in that space, it's not too hard to stay on top of things, but it does take an intentional act to stay on top of it. Like you don't just get information doesn't just show up. You do have to sort of stay on top of it. But yeah, that's my process anyways.
No, it sounds like a good process. It's kind of somewhat similar to what I do anyway. So I like that process. Last question that I have before I jump into like a rapid fire round. And this is kind of like maybe your aspirations. Do you have any interest in being on the other side of the table? Maybe down the road, not now, but like maybe down the road.
Yes. Yeah, totally. Yeah, and maybe I don't know, maybe I glamorize it a little bit. Which I think a lot of people do. And I know having worked with a lot of founders and stuff, I do know that like it's a grind, man. It's not all glamour. At some point it might be, but there's a lot of grind before that happens. There's not usually overnight success. It always seems like there's overnight success, right? But you don't see the 8 or 9 years beforehand where you're like struggle, 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 and then all of a sudden it works. And so I do see myself at some point doing it. To be totally frank, I think my pain tolerance is just a little too low right now. I have like really young kids, and so I think I like my current role where I get to be adjacent to entrepreneurs and founders and sort of see what's going on. And but I do see myself at some point in the future, uh, probably taking a step into the founder world.
That's what's up. I'm trying to
Yeah.
keep a foot in both worlds. So um, we'll see how that ride goes for me. So before I jump into any rapid fire questions, which are not serious, by the way, Aaron, did you have any like other saved rounds or anything like that?
I can ask a couple quick ones. So just follow up on that last question. Would you want to do something related to the law if you started a company, or would you want to do something completely different?
That's a great question. I think I would like to have maybe an attachment to the law, but I would be more interested in it could be legal. But I think more importantly would be the the customer or who I'm serving. So I wouldn't say like I'm super interested in developing a legal application for whatever. But if it was a legal app that was supporting veterans, for example, I'm on board. And so sure, I don't have an issue sticking around the law, but I'd be more interested in, who my target market would be.
That makes sense. And one of the things that's kind of funny about big law, it's the same in consulting. People do it, and as soon as they get in it, they start thinking about their exit ops. They're like, okay, like, how can I leverage this to get a better job or whatever? So as we, I guess, as startups think about potentially bringing lawyers in-house, how should they think about when it makes sense to hire versus just continuing to work with big firms? And then how do you position the job so that it's attractive to someone coming from big law or that kind of like law firm background?
Yeah, that's tough. I do think that the cost of big laws especially is just crazy. It's super high. It's expensive. And the salaries are high too. So it's a really tough sell if you're going to ask someone to come in-house. And typically you'll see folks who will hang out in big law for a couple of years and then make a jump in-house, but they generally don't go into like a startup world, right? It's usually something that's like pretty developed so that their salary is not, a quarter of what they're making, but half of what they're making. Usually people can stomach that a little bit. I think it has surprised me in my career to see how late folks really, like founders in general or companies, wait to hire someone in-house. And I think it makes sense because financially, if you're going to be paying someone a good chunk of money to be an attorney and you're trying to get like a good attorney from, there's good attorneys not in big law, but if you're trying to attract someone who has expertise in startups, who has worked in big law, and you're looking for good credentials, you're going to be paying them a good chunk of money. And it's like a cost analysis, right? Where it doesn't make sense are you hiring them all the time to review contracts because you have big contracts coming in, or are you doing employment agreements? The benefit of a firm realistically is that, you can reach out to whoever you're working with and say like, hey, I have an IP question, and they can pull in an IP lawyer. Or I have an employment question, they'll talk about their employment practice. And so there's a benefit to just using a law firm for a while until you are really doing enough, like, for example, commercial contracts. If you have a ton of commercial contracts that you're doing and you're having someone review them all the time, then maybe it makes sense to bring someone in. But that realistically is down the road quite a bit. And that was a really roundabout, not direct answer to, I don't know. But it's definitely a lot later than I thought before coming into this environment.
That makes sense. That's all I had, Brandon. So we can do rapid fire if you're ready.
Yeah. Oh, I guess that might have been a question for Nick if you're ready. Because
let's do it. Let's do it.
So what's the last book that you read, or a book recommendation? So
I am currently reading 100 Years of Solitude, which is pretty interesting. So I'm enjoying that book. It's a novel.
Aaron Rodgers, did he write that?
No, Gabriel Garcia
Marquez. Yeah.
I'm kidding.
But I think Aaron Rodgers wrote the foreword. Hold on, let me do. I actually have a really good recommendation. I keep this. This is a book I actually just have always here. It's called Venture Deals. Ta-da. Oh. This is a really good one. So this is by Brad Feld, Jason Mendelsohn. It is, so the title is Venture Deals: Be Smarter Than Your Lawyer and Venture Capitalist. It's just a really good primer for financing, like verbiage, language, legalese. It's a really, really good. It's good for lawyers to read through this if you're doing venture work or emerging companies, but it's really good for founders just to have a basic understanding. It helps you sort of like with more pointed questions to your lawyer, which is great and saves you money. It's quicker and more efficient. So that's a good one.
I'll have to check it out. What shows are you binging?
Oh man, I have 3 kids, 7 and younger. So
Bluey?
when they go to, Bluey, that's a good one. When they go to sleep, we go to sleep. um, yeah, I honestly, I am not watching a lot of TV lately. If I do end up watching TV, I like watch an episode of Jeopardy. It's like my old man vice. I love it.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So besides the three kids, what keeps you up at night, if anything?
I do. I mean, kids. uh, I think what keeps me up at night is I'm still on the hunt for something that like I'm super stoked about. Like I like what I do for sure, but I do think like going back to do I ever want to be on the other side of the table? I do think that there's this pull where I'm like, I don't know if I'm quite there. Like I love being a lawyer and I want to keep being a lawyer, but I'm also like really interested in like, I don't know, owning something or I don't know, something else. And so that sort of like the itch of something is still keeping me up at night for sure.
Gotta scratch that itch. Gotta scratch that itch.
I know.
Purple or maroon? Yeah.
Maroon. Purple for sure. Come on.
All right. He's a company man. All right. Favorite podcast. This is the last one.
Oh, favorite podcast. So there's this short-lived podcast in like, man, this is in 2016 maybe, called Question of the Day with Stephen Dubner. And it was just the most off the walls, interesting, like 10, 20-minute episodes where they would just talk about random topics. They would each bring a topic and just randomly dive into it for 10 or 20 minutes. And I loved it. And every once in a while, I go back and re-listen to a couple episodes just because it's fun to listen to. I do really like Shankar Vedantam has Hidden Brain is like I love that one just because I think it's interesting. And then if I ever want to get excited about work, I like to catch up on How I Built This from Guy Raz.
Yeah, that's what I was going to recommend. And the other one, Question of the Day, sounds a lot like Stuff You Should Know. Have you ever heard of that one?
Oh, yeah. I don't think I've ever listened to it.
It's actually pretty good. If you liked Question of the Day, I've never listened to Question of the Day, but based upon like your description of it, it kind of sounds like Stuff You Should Know.
Do you know who's the
the host?
Yeah.
You know what? It's been a little while since I've listened to it. I could probably pull it up, but yeah, I mean it's just like something that you can kind of find anywhere in terms of like podcast platforms. But Stuff You Should Know. Where is it? I have a whole bunch of stuff on my my podcast library. I don't know. Can't find it right away, but yeah, they're pretty good. And I think they're still making episodes, so they just talk about
excellent.
Then
Yeah, I'm on board.
Can I add one last question to the rapid fire?
Yeah.
So what can founders or entrepreneurs do to be better clients? Because I would assume that we're kind of bad clients.
That's a good question. You know, I find the same thing regardless of, you know, what service provider you're using. Just really trying to understand that folks are human is really important. Founders too, like founders, attorneys, accountants, anyone. When you when you say like, hey, I need you to review this employment agreement, can you get it back to me tomorrow? I really hate saying it, you know, it's Christmas Eve and I'm spending time with my family. I'll try to get to it if I can. I don't want to be like an asshole, right, and say no, but just remembering that folks are people, like everyone's a people, is important. But I think in general, so that's one thing. Just remember everyone's a person. Everyone's just trying to get by. But I think also just being open, right? When you say like, hey, this is what I want, this is what I need, and understand, like being clear about your expectations is really helpful, because when you say as a founder, entrepreneur, if you're working with an attorney and you're not quite as open, then it just takes a lot more work to like fish stuff out. Because we're going to get the information eventually, but then it turns into like a lot of back and forth. Like, well, did you do this? Well, no, I didn't do it. Well, can you send me this then? Okay, hang on a second. It's just like that is like pulling teeth, like when you're pulling teeth for, can you just send me the documents you have? And yeah, so I think the as open and honest as you can be just makes things easier for everyone. It'll be quicker, it'll be cheaper. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Makes sense, definitely.
Well, I think I've exhausted all my questions, except for one. How can people find you? Who are listening to this episode and they're like, oh, you know what, I want to reach out. Like, what's a good way to connect with you?
Yeah, just you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm on there pretty often. Again, like I said, just making sure I'm staying up. I'm on there at least once a day, so feel free to send me a message. You can my work email is ntrimis@prosperolaw.com. You can reach out to me that way. But yeah, LinkedIn is probably the fastest. But yeah, I respond to everything, so feel free to send me a message. I'll respond one way or the other. You know, yeah.
Awesome. Well, pretty dope conversation. Always good talking to you. I think that's all we have. Awesome.
Thanks for having me on. Super stoked to see you guys, and really excited to see where you guys go. It's fun to watch your journey. I'm excited to see it keep going.
Yeah, hopefully it's a long journey, so hopefully you can continue to watch it. So yeah. But definitely appreciate you taking the time.
For sure.
It was awesome talking to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Appreciate it.
No problem. Talk to you soon.
See ya.
Bye.